Many of the most fearsome military contests in history have been fought upon the sea. Their outcomes have determined the fate of nations. Historically, those who ruled the waves ruled the world. Now, Top 10 will test, assess, and grade the most feared and powerful fighting ships in naval history. From mighty destroyers to humble sloops, the ship that can hit the hardest and fastest has the edge. But it's not only the ability to dole out punishment. To claim the title of the greatest fighting vessel in history, a ship must be able to take it on the chin and come back strong. Based on scientific analysis, expert opinion, audience polls, and technical comparison, we've constructed a 5-point matrix that will rank the top 10 fighting ships of all time. Coming in at number 10 on our list, a ship that was once described as the most powerful and invincible battle wagon in the world. Hood class battle cruiser. Displacement, 42,500 tons. Propulsion, 4 Brown Curtis geared turbines producing 144,000 horsepower. Speed, 31 knots. Range, 9,574 kilometers at 18 knots. Protection, maximum armor, 38 centimeters. Principal armament, 8 38-centimeter guns. Crew, 1,418. On the 31st of May 1916, in the Battle of Jutland off the coast of Denmark, the two most powerful navies in the world fought one of the great ship battles of the 20th century. Both Britain and Germany suffered huge losses to their fleets, and the battleship's reputation as invincible suffered as well. But the British naval brass were not deterred, and they came up with a radical new prototype for a fighting ship. They called it the Hood.
The Hood was the first of what was going to be a whole new class of ships being built around the world at the end of World War I, which is the super battlecruiser. A battlecruiser which had the punching power of a battleship truly, and still had the high speed and was still fairly well armored.
Completed in 1920, the 260-meter Hood was the largest ship in the Royal Navy's fleet. With a top speed of 31 knots and armed with 8 38-centimeter guns, the Hood represented the new generation of fast fighting ships.
One of the reasons that she is a beautiful ship is that you would prefer to have your side armor at an angle. So when a shell comes in, it tries to go through a plated angle, it's more likely to bounce out. And so she's got that nice flared hull form, which we find attractive.
The Hood has nice lines to it. It's like a nice looking car. Maybe hard to pin exactly why, but we all know a Ferrari looks good and a Pacer does not.
At the time, the mighty Hood was considered the greatest warship ever built. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, it toured the world, showing off its power and size.
Between the wars, the Royal Navy was still the premier navy in the world, and it was the premier ship in the premier navy. And if it looks the part and the Hood looked the part, then people will believe it's the part.
But by the beginning of World War II, things had changed. Adolf Hitler's navy had built even more modern and sophisticated battleships, and the Hood was nearly 20 years old and in desperate need of a refit. On the 24th of May 1941, the Hood's shortcomings were made apparent when she came up against the German battleship Bismarck and heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen.
There are a few ships' names in Britain that go down in history. Hood is certainly up there. But actually, when you look at it, in terms of operational expectancy, we expected more from Hood than we got. And it really didn't come up and cut the mustard. It was an older design than Bismarck. Bismarck ran rings around it.
At a range of 23,000 meters, the ships opened fire. It took only 5 salvos from the Bismarck to pierce the Hood's deck armor and smash the flagship of the Royal Navy. Within 8 minutes, the Hood sank. Out of a crew of 1,418, only 3 men survived.
The big regret is she wasn't rebuilt didn't have the time or the money to rebuild her. She may have survived the Bismarck, and she may have had a much bigger role.
Because the Hood was sunk so quickly by the Bismarck, its protection rating is low, as is its firepower score. Marks are higher for fear factor and innovation. Its service length of 21 years gets a good score. But that's not enough to place the Hood any higher than 10th place on our list. From the German battleship that sunk the mighty Hood to a modern marvel with $1 billion price tag, the top 9 fighting ships in naval history are still to come. Over the past century, many wars have been won or lost at sea. And whilst naval power may no longer be the primary mark of a nation's might, the battleship's place in history is indisputable. Continuing our countdown of the top 10 fighting ships of all time, a ship that Nazi Germany looked to as a war winner, and one whose demise made it a legend, the pocket battleship. The Deutschland-class pocket battleship. Displacement, 16,200 tons. Propulsion, 8 MAN diesel engines producing 56,800 horsepower. Speed, 26 knots. Range, 14,500 kilometers at 19 knots. Protection, maximum armor, 13 centimeters. Principal armament, 6 28-centimeter guns. Crew, 1,150. After the bloody battles of World War I, the Allies and Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles, limiting the German Navy to 6 battleships of no greater than 10,000 tons displacement each. But in May 1931, Germany flouted the treaty by launching its latest fighting ship. Called the Deutschland, it was the forerunner of a completely new class of ship, known as Panzerschiff, or pocket battleship.
It's interesting the ship was laid down before Hitler came to power, and it stretched the Versailles Treaty. It shows how far Germany was already interested in moving to a more military standing.
By 1934, 2 more Panzerschiff-class ships had been launched, the Admiral Scheer and the Graf Spee.
The whole thought process behind the pocket battleship, and the one that frightened everyone, was the fast enough to run away from everyone and powerful enough to smash their way into a convoy protected by a heavy cruiser.
The pocket battleship's speed and power was thanks to an innovative design. By using diesel engines instead of steam turbines and an electrically welded hull instead of rivets, the Deutschland class was lighter than its counterparts and could cruise for greater distances. It sent shivers of fear throughout the Allied navies.
It had pretty good speed. It had a weapons package that made it very tricky for any cruiser to handle, and enough speed that it could outrun pretty much any of the existing dreadnoughts are still around.
When World War II began, the pocket battleships were ready for action. In the first 3 months of the war, the Graf Spee sunk 9 merchant ships, totaling over 50,000 tons, furthering its reputation as an invincible fighter. But on the 13th of December 1939, that reputation was put to the test when 3 British cruisers outside the Uruguayan port of Montevideo cornered the Graf Spee. In what was called the Battle of the River Plate, the Graf Spee knocked out all the guns on one cruiser and seriously damaged the other 2. But the Graf Spee had a major design flaw. Her armor was just 13 centimeters thick and could not withstand the British 15 and 20 centimeter shells.
Graf Spee, although she had quite large guns, was very lightly armored along the lines of a light cruiser. It never intended to take on a ship of similar weaponry as she had.
Badly damaged, the Graf Spee limped into the port of Montevideo, but Uruguay was neutral, and after 48 hours insisted that the Graf Spee leave or be interned. Unwilling to let his badly damaged ship fight another battle against the waiting British, the German captain sank his own ship and committed suicide, ending the myth that the pocket battleships were invincible.
Like all ships, it was vulnerable to being outnumbered. It's all very well to be big and able to outrun or anything it couldn't outfight, but it could still get cornered.
By the end of the war, Germany's two remaining pocket battleships, the Admiral Scheer and the Deutschland, had also been destroyed. But during their brief lives, all three had demonstrated that they could hit hard, earning the respect of the Allied navies. So for fear factor and firepower, they score well. Marks for innovation are good, but protection and service length let them down. So the Deutschland class lands at number 9 on our countdown of the top 10 fighting ships. Next on the list, a ship that's more than proved itself in battle, with enough armor to take a hit and the firepower to retaliate. The ship that took the fight to the Japanese in the Pacific War. The Essex class aircraft carrier. Displacement, 34,880 tons. Propulsion, 4 shaft steam turbines producing 150,000 horsepower. Speed, 33 knots. Range, 28,000 kilometers at 12 knots. Protection, maximum armor, 8 centimeters. Principal armament, 12 13-centimeter guns, 68 40mm anti-aircraft guns, and 85 aircraft. Crew, 2,687. In December 1941, Japanese bombers took off from aircraft carriers in the Pacific and attacked America at Pearl Harbor. Immediately, the United States launched a massive building program to produce fast carriers that could take the fight back to Japan. On the 31st of December 1942, the first of the new Essex-class carriers was commissioned. At 263 meters long, a displacement of 33,000 tons fully loaded, and the ability to carry up to 100 aircraft, the Essex class exemplified the long-range striking power that had become so critical to military success.
You have to judge an aircraft carrier's power by what it can launch from its deck, and the mahogany decks of the Essex-class carriers could launch tremendous firepower. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the admiral in charge was able to launch over 200 aircraft in less than 10 minutes once they had sighted the Japanese fleet. That's an achievement that really could not even be matched today.
Once you get into 1943, and especially into 1944, the vast majority of aircraft that were operated in battles like the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf came from Essex-class carriers.
With a crew of more than 2,600 and a range of 28,000 kilometers, the Essex-class carriers were a formidable adversary. They became the #1 target of the kamikaze pilots.
They were rugged, they could take attacks, whether from bombs or eventually from the kamikazes, and keep the march forward with relentless naval air power extending out over the Central Pacific.
But maintaining that progress wasn't easy. On the 17th of March 1945, during an airstrike against the Japanese island of Honshu, one Essex-class carrier, the USS Franklin, came under attack as wave after wave of suicide pilots descended. For over 12 hours, the ship was a blazing furnace. 724 crewmen were killed. But the Franklin was so well designed and built that she didn't sink. In fact, she was the most badly damaged US warship to survive an enemy attack during World War II.
The Essex class, compared to the British carriers, did not have the armored flight deck, but they did have fairly extensive compartmentation, which allowed them to both help control fires and also control flooding. And although several of the Essex-class carriers were hit with kamikazes, none were ever sunk in action.
In total, 24 Essex-class ships were built, more than any other class of large carrier. After the war ended, they remained in service for another 30 years. No other class of aircraft carrier has served for so long, so effectively.
In pure design terms, the Essex class is a tremendous evolution. But to see its real impact, the true impact of the Essex class is the fact that it made it possible for the Allies to win in the Pacific in World War II.
The Essex class scores well on our matrix, with good marks for fear factor and protection. Equally good are its scores for service length, innovation, and firepower. So the Essex earns the number 8 spot on our list of the top 10 fighting ships. Next up is a battleship that took on the might of the British Navy and fought its way into history. The Bismarck-class battleship. Displacement, 50,153 tons. Propulsion, 3 geared steam turbines producing 150,170 horsepower. Speed, 30 knots. Range, 15,800 kilometers at 19 knots. Protection, maximum armor, 36 centimeters. Principal armament, 8 38-centimeter guns. Crew, 2,200. Launched in February 1939, the Bismarck was said to be Adolf Hitler's favorite ship. One of 2 German battleships in her class, fully loaded, each weighed a hefty 50,000 tons.
The Bismarck was a ship not built to treaty limitations, so she was about 20% bigger than the ships being built by the Royal Navy and by the U.S. Navy at the time. From that standpoint, there was no ship in the Royal Navy at the time that could quite match her toe-to-toe on paper.
At the beginning of the war, Germany commissioned the Bismarck into service. Her sister ship, the Tirpitz, was still being fitted out, so the German naval brass were anxious to get the Bismarck into battle.
The German policy was not to send out a ship until she'd been in commission 6 months. If they'd waited a few months, they would have had 2 battleships out so they could be mutually supporting. One could see that the German Navy thinking, oh my gosh, we're going to invade Russia in June, the Army's going to win again, they're going to win the war, we'll have contributed nothing, we better get out there and get some publicity before the German Army victory occurs.
On the 19th of May 1941, Bismarck went on her first war patrol in the North Atlantic. She was accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. Their mission? To attack the Allies' vital convoys. On May the 25th, the Bismarck sighted Britain's HMS Hood. 5 salvos from the Bismarck's superior guns sent the Hood to the bottom of the ocean. The British Navy wanted revenge. The order went out, sink the Bismarck. For over 3 days, the British fleet stalked the German battleship. Finally, on the morning of May the 27th, with its steering smashed by torpedo bombers, the pride of the German army was cornered. After 3 hours of continuous shelling, the German captain gave the order to sink and abandon the Bismarck. Over 2,000 men were lost.
What's fascinating about the Bismarck is that the technology was in fact so advanced on it, it didn't actually understand that the Brits had not caught up with that technology. So its close-range and medium-range anti-aircraft systems couldn't be calibrated for the slow flying speed of the fiery Swordfish torpedo bomber. So it was able to be stopped.
With the sinking of the Bismarck, Britain set her sights on the Tirpitz. And on November the 12th, 1944, exacted revenge. Holed up in a Norwegian fjord, the Tirpitz was eventually destroyed by 6-ton tallboy bombs dropped by the RAF. The threat of German battleship supremacy was finally over. Because the Bismarck class was such a menace, its fear factor rating has to be high, as does its firepower score. But protection, innovation, and service length let it down. So the jewel of the Nazi German fleet can go no higher than number 7 on our list of the top 10 fighting ships. Next up, another World War II heavyweight. A heavily armed and fortified battleship that proved itself again and again. The North Carolina-class battleship. Displacement, 44,800 tons. Propulsion, quadruple steam turbines producing 121,000 horsepower. Speed, 27 knots. Range, 29,000 kilometers. Protection, maximum armor, 40 centimeters. Principal armament, 9 40-centimeter guns. Crew, 1,880. Launched on the 1st of June 1940, the USS Washington was the first of the new generation American battleships that featured better torpedo and deck armor and more speed. 12 days later, its sister ship, the North Carolina, was launched. These two ships became known as the North Carolina class. Both had seen changes throughout their design and building phases, due in part to an international treaty that limited the size of their guns.
The North Carolina, of course, was famous for having been designed as 3 quad 14-inch mounts with a little option to put 16-inch at the last moment, because there was a clause in the treaty saying, well, if the Japanese don't play fair, you can go to 16-inch guns.
She was finally fitted out with 9 40-centimeter guns. Firing a 1,200-kilo shell, the guns had a range of nearly 34,000 meters. And coupled with dozens of smaller guns, both ships were formidable fighters.
The ships were very successful both in surface combat as early as 1942. Also, there had been enough foresight to put a fairly large anti-aircraft battery on, and they were very successful as carrier escorts and as well as doing the supporting Marines in amphibious invasions.
By August 1942, the North Carolina was in the thick of it, in battles off Guadalcanal and Tulagi. The strength of her torpedo armor was soon demonstrated. In late 1942, the Japanese submarine I-19 tore a hole in her side, measuring 9 by 5 meters. Despite taking on nearly 1,000 tons of water, she managed to make it to Pearl Harbor for repairs. At first, the USS Washington operated in the Arctic, guarding the Icelandic convoys for the Allies. But in late August 1942, she too was in the Pacific and demonstrated her firepower in the Battle of Savo Island, when she took on the Japanese battlecruiser Kirishima. Using a mix of radar and optical fire control, the Washington, in 7 minutes, fired 75 40-centimeter shells and hundreds of 13-centimeter, leaving the Kirishima a burning, crippled wreck.
You have to understand fire control. And the U.S. had, by the middle of the war, the best radar. It was so good that you could see your own shell splashes. And then, oh, I missed. I'll move it in closer.
The Washington's success put it in an elite group of large battleships that have won in head-to-head combat against ships of a similar class. Although built to World War I standards, both the North Carolina and the Washington survived World War II, and so they earned strong marks for protection and innovation. Marks for firepower and fear factor are good as well. But a relatively short service life marks them down, gaining them the number 6 spot on our list. Coming up, a royal battleship that fought in both world wars and still came out on top. And the giant that holds the title of the largest warship ever built, as we continue counting down to the number 1 fighting ship of all time. Halfway through our countdown of the top 10 fighting ships in naval history. Number 5, a flyweight fighter with a super heavyweight punch. A ship whose creed was kill or be killed. The Fletcher-class destroyer. Displacement, standard, 2,325 tons. Propulsion, 2 geared turbines producing 60,000 shaft horsepower. Range, 12,000 kilometers at 15 knots. Protection, 1.3 centimeters over vital areas. Principal armament, 5 13-centimeter guns. Crew, 329. Sunday, December the 7th, 1941. The US Pacific Fleet lay in ruins at Pearl Harbor. The next day, America was at war. Immediately, the US Navy began making ships to take the fight back to Japan to avenge Pearl Harbor. 11 shipyards were tasked with building a new class of fast, heavily armed destroyers, the Fletcher class. Soon, these sleek ships were coming off the slipways. 115 meters long and nearly 2,900 tons when fully loaded, the Fletchers were significantly larger than any previous American destroyer. And they were the first to be fitted with surface and air warning radar. With their 60,000 shaft horsepower engines delivering a speed of over 36 knots, the Fletchers were designed to be formidable fighters. In early 1943, the first 5 Fletcher-class destroyers arrived in the Pacific. Their mission? To target and smash the Japanese supply convoys. Loaded with weapons, each was a floating gun platform. Their 5 13-centimeter guns could fire a 24-kilo projectile over 16,000 meters, with a ceiling of almost 11,000 meters for anti-aircraft. Their 40mm rate of fire was 160 rounds per minute, and for the 20mm, a staggering 450 per minute. The Fletchers also had sophisticated sonar, enabling them to hunt down anything beneath the surface. During the Pacific War, Fletcher destroyers sank 29 Japanese submarines. But it was for staving off air attacks that these ships became legendary and earned their nickname the Fighting Fletchers. On the 25th of October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese, desperate to defend their positions, turned to a new form of attack, the kamikaze. Again, the Fletchers were on the front line of battle. Their mission was clear: target and kill any kamikaze aircraft that came within the vicinity of an Allied aircraft carrier. In the weeks that followed, Fletcher-class destroyers engaged more than 1,500 kamikaze attackers. By the end of the war, 175 of these tough destroyers had been built and sent into battle. But at a price, 25 were lost. The Fletcher class scores well on our matrix for both firepower and fear factor. Its innovation score is strong as well. Marks for protection and service length are also good. So the Fighting Fletchers earn the number 5 spot on our list of the top 10 fighting ships. This next ship is at the cutting edge of modern technology. It has a price tag of $1 billion and is considered to be one of the most powerful ships in the world. The Ticonderoga class, missile cruiser. Displacement, 9,466 tons. Propulsion, 4 General Electric petrol turbine engines producing 80,000 horsepower. Speed, 30 knots. Range, 11,000 kilometers at 20 knots. Protection, Kevlar armor over vital areas. Principal armament, 2 M45 13-centimeter guns, 2 Mark 41 vertical launch systems. Crew, 400. America has one of the most powerful navies in the world. And among her vast fleet is this mighty surface combatant, the Ticonderoga-class cruiser. Initially developed in the 1970s during the Cold War arms race, its first role was that of guided missile destroyer. But the American Navy later decided that something bigger was needed. So the Ticonderogas were upgraded to fast cruisers in 1980.
You have to remember the environment the ships were built in. It was the big red menace. The Russians were building ships like crazy. They're building bombers like crazy. And the policy at the time was, we need these ships, we need Aegis, we need it now, we can save time, we can save effort by building on this legacy product line.
With a length of over 173 meters and a top speed of 30 knots, the Ticonderogas are protected by Kevlar armor over all vital areas. They were also the first surface ships equipped with the Aegis combat system, a highly sophisticated, fully integrated surface-to-air weapons system.
This is an advanced radar that gets rid of the rotating radar and the sort of classic sweep that we all think of on a radar screen, and allows the ship to look in all directions at once and track large numbers of targets.
With its clean, uncluttered decks, a Ticonderoga cruiser may not look that powerful, but looks can be deceiving. This ship packs a mighty punch.
A cruiser like the USS Ticonderoga class or a companion, the USS Shiloh, one of that class, can launch Tomahawk land attack missiles. These missiles are fairly light, but their ability to fly through terrain following to any pre-programmed target makes them a tremendous weapon of war.
Along with the Aegis weapons system, each ship has two M45 13-centimeter guns, close-in weapons systems, torpedo launchers, and the capability to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles. The Ticonderogas can hit hard and deep into enemy territory. As the forerunners of the computer-controlled ships, the Ticonderogas are at the center of today's digital battlefield. They've seen service off the coast of Lebanon, Kuwait, and Korea, acting in both peacekeeping and offensive roles.
They're a big part of patrolling waters that need to remain clear and open for other shipping, both commercial and military shipping. So the cruiser is an all-purpose, heavy firepower weapon, but also one that enables other forces to do their jobs.
Having been in service for over 20 years, and with no plans for them to retire in the foreseeable future, the Ticonderoga class gets a good score for service length, as it does for fear factor and innovation. And its protection and firepower scores are both high as well. So the Ticonderoga cruises into the number 4 spot on our list. Continuing our countdown of the top 10 fighting ships, this next class of battleship fought in both world wars and still came through a winner. The Queen Elizabeth class battleship. Displacement, 36,450 tons. Propulsion, quadruple screw steam turbines producing 80,000 horsepower. Speed, 23 knots. Range, 8,300 kilometers at 10 knots. Protection, maximum armor, 33 centimeters. Principal armament, 8 38-centimeter guns. Crew, 1,190. Launched in 1913, the Queen Elizabeth was the first of a new design of fast battleships powered by oil rather than coal. By early 1916, she was joined by 4 sister ships, Barham, Malaya, Valiant, and Warspite, armed with 8 38-centimeter main guns and 16 15-centimeter secondary. The Queen Elizabeth class were the most powerful British warships in World War I.
I think in looking back at the World War I dreadnoughts, by nature of being at the end of that line of development, it represents the zenith of that design, certainly within the Royal Navy.
During the 1930s, the class was modernized. Now sporting only one smokestack, they were fitted with anti-aircraft capability. Their main guns were upgraded to fire an 862-kilo shell over 29,000 meters. The Queen Elizabeths were ready when World War II began.
Queen Elizabeth class allowed there to be still ships in the beginning of the Second World War that were big, they were slow, but they were big and formidable. They had a fear factor. They kept the Germans in port.
As the war grew in scope and ferocity, it seemed that the Queen Elizabeth class were everywhere. The Warspite had a particularly distinguished career.
There's a movie made several years ago, Forrest Gump, and he has this way of turning up in every major event. And the Warspite seems to have a similar knack for turning up at major events.
But the Queen Elizabeth class was not invincible. In November 1941, the Barham featured in one of the most famous pieces of archival combat footage ever shot when she was torpedoed by the German U-boat U-331. More than 800 of her crew were killed. By the end of the war, all 4 remaining Queen Elizabeth-class battleships were still fighting, maintaining their legacy. But it was Warspite that stood out amongst the rest.
The Warspite was just everywhere. So the taxpayers got their money's worth.
Warspite was one of the Royal Navy's most successful warships, and the Queen Elizabeth class were some of the toughest battleships ever built. So they earn high marks for protection rating and for fear factor. Scores for innovation and firepower are also good. Their service length of over 30 years is excellent. So the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships come in at third place on our list of the top 10 fighting ships. In second place, a ship whose flight deck is longer than 3 football pitches, refuels once every 13 years, and whose power is unmatched anywhere in the world. The Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. Displacement, 97,000 tons. Propulsion, 2 nuclear reactors driving 4 turbines, producing 260,000 horsepower. Speed, 30 knots. Range, unlimited. Protection, none. Principal armament, 85 aircraft. Crew, 5,680. In 1975, the largest warship ever built was commissioned into the US Navy. Called the Nimitz, this aircraft carrier was the first of 10 ships in the class. When the final one comes into service, they will have a combined displacement of just under 1 million tons. But it's not just their weight that's impressive. These carriers have humbling dimensions. 333 meters in length, 77 meters in width. Their flight decks are so large, they can handle more than 85 aircraft. And with a crew of over 5,600, the Nimitz class points to a significant change in recognized carrier tactics.
The Navy decided that carriers had to go solo in the maritime strategy of the 1980s. The carrier plus its battle group would operate as an autonomous unit, whether that was for crisis response, diplomatic forward presence, or as part of a major war in Europe.
With the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Cold War ended. The Nimitz-class carrier's role changed to one of peacekeeper.
Today, the appearance of a U.S. Navy carrier off your shores, if you're a friend of the U.S., tells you that the U.S. is there backing you. If you're an opponent of the U.S., tells you that we're interested in changing your policy.
With the ability to go anywhere in the world at a moment's notice, at a speed of 30 knots, the Nimitz class is invaluable to the U.S. Navy. But what makes the Nimitz unique is its 2 nuclear reactors that enable each of these carriers to roam the world indefinitely.
For the first time, you have a fighting ship that is not limited by fuel. It's not limited by the need to take on water as the 18th century fleets did. It's limited really only by aviation ordnance and some other critical supplies. So with underway replenishment, the Nimitz class can remain at sea almost indefinitely.
In addition to its aircraft, each ship is heavily armed in its own right, with NATO Sea Sparrow launchers, 20mm Phalanx mounts, and RIM 116 rolling airframe missiles. But it was through the use of its aircraft in the Afghanistan conflict that the Nimitz class demonstrated its true value.
The Navy kept carriers in place off Afghanistan consistently, and it was only the Navy that was able to provide fighter cover for air superiority. That was needed in Afghanistan so that helicopters, transports, and bombers could operate over Afghan airspace.
And the Nimitz carriers were there at the start of the Second Gulf War, once again supplying an attacking platform for its formidable air wing.
There's no doubt that the Nimitz-class carriers are the most powerful warships ever to sail the seas. And the reason for that rests in the abilities of their air wings.
Because of their size and capability, the US plans to keep them in service for the foreseeable future. It's a ship whose usefulness may never expire.
There will come a time, in a decade's time, a decade and a half's time, when there will be a new rising challenge to the United States. The maritime power projection will still be from the carrier, from its 90 or so strike aircraft. And that's why you've got to keep them. You can't afford to lose them.
So for innovation and fear factor, they score high on our matrix. With a service length of over 20 years, marks in that category are high as well, as is its protection rating. And with the ability to carry over 85 aircraft, its firepower is off the charts, pushing the Nimitz into second place on our list of the top 10 fighting ships. Coming up, the #1 ship on our list, A fast battleship that stood the test of time and rightly deserves to be called the greatest fighting ship in military history. Continuing our countdown of the 10 greatest fighting ships in military history, it's time for number 1, the best of the best. The Iowa-class fast battleship. Displacement, 57,450 tons. Propulsion, quadruple screw steam turbines producing 212,000 horsepower. Speed, 33 knots. Range, 28,000 kilometers at 12 knots. Protection, maximum armor, 46 centimeters. Principal armament, 9 41-centimeter guns. Crew, 1,921. On August the 27th, 1942, the USS Iowa was launched in New York. She was the first of the Iowa-class battleships, a fast, powerful fighter designed to take on the might of the Japanese Navy.
The Iowa class, of course, had the benefit of 2 test classes. They had the North Carolinas and the Alabamas to learn how to design battleships.
Over the next 2 years, the Iowa's sister ships, the New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin, came into service.
Compared to the ships that came before, she's about 150 feet longer. In naval design, a longer, narrower ship is easier to push through the water. They virtually doubled the amount of power. So it's sort of simple physics. More power in a ship that's easier to move makes it go faster.
But it was the Iowa's weaponry that made them so unique. Their Mark 7 41-centimeter guns could fire a 1,200-kilo shell up to 39 kilometers. But this was no ordinary shell.
When you're penetrating armor, there's a thing called frontal density. It's not just the weight of the shell, it's the weight of the shell trying to punch the hole through. Well, the 16-inch 50 heavy shell was almost as good armor penetrator as the Japanese 18.1-inch shell.
America entered into hardly any action without the Iowas, from escorting the fast carrier forces to bombarding the Marshall Islands, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Hokkaido, and Honshu. The Iowas were always at the center of the action.
It's certainly one of the most impressive ships. As the last battleship design ever really built, it is the ultimate expression of the battleship. Battleships have a unique ability to create awe, and even if you know nothing about naval ship design or weaponry, you can sense the power that's there on the ship.
In August 1945, the USS Missouri, the newest in the Iowa class, hosted the official Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay, a fitting tribute to a great fighting ship. But the story of the Iowa class doesn't end there. Decommissioned at the end of World War II, the Iowas were soon recalled for action in the Korean War. Retired again, they were called up once more for Vietnam. And then, incredibly, almost 50 years after the first Iowa was launched, they were made ready for the Cold War.
One of the reasons the battleships came back in the 80s was we'd run our heavy cruisers for so long that they were essentially run out, worn out, the Des Moines class. And so the battleships, being low-mileage ships, came back, oddly enough, as a heavy cruiser replacement.
In 1991, the Iowas answered the call yet again when they went into action during the First Gulf War. Now modified to carry Tomahawk cruise missiles, giving them a 2,600-kilometer punch, backed up by 130-kilometer Harpoon anti-ship missiles and their 41-centimeter guns, this World War II warrior had become one of the most powerful ships of the late 20th century.
Among all the gunships of the world, I think it's a culmination of the breed. And we kept on pulling them back. I mean, it's one of those things where that whenever you had a need, the only thing that would scratch that need was a battleship.
No other battleship in history has had so many weapons in its arsenal. So on our matrix, its firepower score is outstanding. No other battleship even came close to equaling their longevity, so the service length rating is off the scale. Fear factor, innovation, and protection are all also excellent, putting the Iowa-class battleships firmly into first place on our list. So there it is, 10 fighting ships that have shaped the course of naval warfare and history. But it's the mighty Iowa-class battleship's massive firepower, an incredible 35-knot top speed, superior armor protection, and a service length of over 50 years that rightly earns it the title of the greatest of all time.